We kind of knew what the rhythm of the year was. So things like that will change, and how we are part of the support for the monarchy may change slightly. Without the Queen, in many respects, need to deal with it.
The palace was asleep, yet the air inside Windsor Castle trembled with an unspoken urgency. Hidden behind locked doors, Princess Anne pressed her seal onto a document that could shatter the monarchy's fragile balance. It was a royal decree, silent, final, and explosive. But why was Anne, the loyal daughter of Queen Elizabeth II, forced to sign it in secret? And why did its words strike directly at Camilla's family? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The stillness of the night belied the storm Anne was unleashing with the stroke of her hand. This was no ordinary document, it was a decree that would reach far beyond the walls of Windsor. It wasn't simply ink on parchment. It was a warning, a decision steeped in quiet rage, and a line drawn firmly in the sand. As she set the seal, she knew that history itself would echo this moment, for she had dared to do what even kings feared: place family beneath duty. Alone in her chamber, Anne's face carried the weight of 1,000 unshed words. The candles flickered, as though bowing to the gravity of her act. Every shadow on the stone walls seemed to whisper names: Camilla, Charles, Elizabeth, and each one carried its own judgment. But Anne remained resolute. The decree was necessary, for she had seen the monarchy tilting under the weight of ambition and indulgence. Camilla's family had grown bold, far too bold, and their presence at the heart of royal affairs threatened to corrode the legacy their mother had safeguarded for 70 years. This was not an impulsive act, nor the whim of a sister tired of her brother's choices. No, it was the culmination of whispers passed from generation to generation, a secret that Anne had carried like a burning coal within her chest. She remembered her mother's voice, calm yet unyielding, warning her of what might come if lines were blurred, if trust was placed in the wrong hands. It was Elizabeth's voice, not her own, that echoed in the chamber as the seal struck the parchment. And yet, even as her hand lingered on the paper, the sharp sting of betrayal pierced her heart. Betrayal not only of her brother, the king, but of the bond they had shared since childhood. She knew this act would cut deep, would draw blood from wounds that could never heal. Still, she pressed on. For Anne was not merely a daughter, a sister, or a princess. She was the guardian of something greater, the living shield of the crown itself. Unbeknownst to Charles, whose faith in his wife clouded his judgment, Anne had quietly involved William. The heir understood the delicate threads holding the monarchy together, and in hushed conversations, he had given his reluctant blessing. It was William who understood that silence now would mean chaos later, that Anne's hand was not driven by malice, but by the cold necessity of survival. The corridors of Windsor may have been silent, but the decision made that night would thunder across Britain by dawn. And when the world learned of Anne's act, they would see not a sister's betrayal, but a daughter's devotion. A promise kept to a queen who had passed, but whose shadow still commanded the throne. But this decree didn't appear out of thin air. It was forged in years of resentment, unspoken vows, and the ghost of a queen whose final wish had never been honored. Before she left this world, Queen Elizabeth II left behind more than jewels and ceremonies. She left a hidden instruction, a wish whispered only to her daughter Anne. And that wish held the power to decide who would remain tied to the throne and who would be cast away forever. It was not spoken in public, nor written into the official record. It was entrusted only to Anne, the daughter Elizabeth believed carried the strength, discipline, and unwavering loyalty that no one else possessed. Anne had always been the silent guardian, the one who shunned the spotlight but bore the greatest burdens. Elizabeth knew that in Anne's heart lived a resilience that no storm could shatter, and so it was to her that this secret was given. In their final days together, mother and daughter shared moments that few could ever imagine. Elizabeth's words, though quiet, burned like fire. She spoke of the dangers of blurred lines, of outsiders taking too much ground, and of the sacred duty to preserve the monarchy's soul. There were letters too small, handwritten notes kept away from the eyes of courtiers, each one a warning, each one a prophecy of the trials to come. Anne tucked them away, carrying them as both shield and burden. And though Elizabeth was a queen to the world, to Anne she was a mother, yet even in that intimate bond, the late monarch spoke with the steel of a ruler. She reminded Anne that love could be blinding, that loyalty to blood sometimes bred weakness, and that the survival of the crown demanded sacrifices no one else dared to make. These words would haunt Anne long after Elizabeth's passing, for they were not simply guidance, they were a command. Camilla's presence during Elizabeth's reign had always been a delicate matter, never spoken of openly, yet never truly ignored. Elizabeth's eyes often revealed what her lips did not: unease. The Queen was a master of composure, but in Anne's presence, she allowed the smallest cracks to show. Anne knew her mother's worries ran deep, not of Camilla alone, but of the family tethered to her name. They were not of royal blood, and yet their ambitions whispered louder with every passing year. Bound by oath, Anne remained silent. She watched the family grow closer to the throne, their influence creeping in like ivy on stone. Every charity appearance, every whispered negotiation, every subtle suggestion, they were pieces of a puzzle Elizabeth had already seen completed in her mind's eye. And Anne, carrying her mother's secret, knew she could not act until the day came when silence would no longer protect the monarchy, but instead threaten to destroy it. It was the ultimate test of loyalty, her mother's legacy against her brother's happiness, the monarchy's integrity against the ambitions of a family who should never have had a seat at the table. For Anne, there was no room for hesitation. She knew the crown did not survive centuries by yielding to desire. It survived by choosing discipline over indulgence, duty over comfort, sacrifice over selfishness. The wish her mother had whispered became the pulse that guided Anne's every thought. She felt it when she saw Camilla's children standing too close to royal circles. She felt it when whispers of influence grew louder, when boundaries blurred, and respect turned into presumption. Each moment carried her closer to the breaking point, closer to the day when silence would become betrayal. That final wish was buried under layers of silence until Camilla's family made one unforgivable move that forced Anne's hand. It began innocently: dinner, a conversation, a photo. But soon, whispers turned into outrage. Camilla's family wasn't just enjoying royal privileges, they were leveraging them, inching closer to power that was never theirs to claim. What looked harmless at first glance soon revealed itself as a dangerous pattern, and those who watched closely began to see the cracks spreading beneath the polished surface of the monarchy. At the center of the storm were Laura Lopes and Tom Parker Bowles, names that once lived comfortably in the background of royal affairs. But now, their presence grew louder, bolder, and impossible to ignore. Invitations to private gatherings turned into influence at public events. Laura was spotted too often beside key figures at ceremonial occasions, while Tom's opinions began echoing in conversations that should have remained the domain of the crown. What had been dismissed as harmless proximity began to look like positioning, a deliberate attempt to step deeper into royal circles that had always been reserved for blood, not by marriage, but by lineage. The unease sharpened when whispers of hidden dealings began to circulate. Charitable funds connected to royal patronages were quietly tied to ventures benefiting Camilla's family. Nothing appeared on the surface, no obvious scandal, no evidence that would stain the monarchy's reputation overnight. But behind closed doors, the signs were there. Influence was being traded like currency, and the monarchy's resources were being bent toward ambitions that had no rightful place within its walls. The monarchy was not a prize to be shared, yet the Parker Bowles name crept closer to it with every passing month. For Charles, blinded by love and loyalty to his wife, the growing involvement of her family seemed natural, even harmless. But for William and Catherine, it was alarming. They confided quietly to one another that the monarchy could not afford blurred lines, especially in an age when scrutiny was fierce and trust was fragile. The heir to the throne could not watch silently while those without claim to the crown shaped its direction from the shadows. Catherine, ever perceptive, saw the danger in silence and urged William to keep his guard. Each private conversation between them grew heavier, their concern turning into frustration that the king could not or would not see the truth. And all the while, Princess Anne remained still but watchful. She had seen this story unfold before, in warnings passed down by Elizabeth herself. The Queen had cautioned her daughter that the monarchy could never be compromised by outsiders whose ambitions threatened its foundation. Now, as Anne observed Camilla's family weaving their way deeper into royal life, she recognized the unmistakable fulfillment of her mother's fear. Elizabeth's silent wish, her whispered instruction, echoed louder than ever in Anne's mind. The time for silence was ending, and Anne knew that duty was about to demand a sacrifice she had hoped she would never need to make. But if Camilla's family thought their quiet maneuvers would go unchecked, they underestimated the one royal who had always watched from the shadows: Princess Anne. Anne had stayed silent for decades. She never craved the crown, never demanded attention. But now, as she faced Camilla's growing influence, her silence turned into action. She knew she had to draw a line that could never be crossed again. In the stillness of private chambers, Anne began to share her burden with William and Catherine. These were not casual conversations, but whispered meetings cloaked in secrecy, where the weight of history hung heavy in the air. William, torn between loyalty to his father and duty to the throne, struggled to find words. Catherine, however, spoke with quiet conviction. She urged Anne to act, reminding her that Elizabeth's warnings were no longer distant echoes but pressing realities. If they did not act now, the monarchy itself risked being reshaped by hands that had no rightful claim to its future. For Anne, every word felt like a blade. To move against Camilla's family was, in truth, to move against her brother. Charles had placed his heart in their hands, blind to the dangers, unwilling to see the creeping erosion of royal tradition. Protecting the monarchy meant betraying the man she had stood beside since childhood. It was an agony Anne bore silently, the kind of inner conflict that crushed even the strongest souls. But Anne's strength had always been forged in sacrifice, and this sacrifice would become her defining one. Her reputation had long been one of loyalty. The public admired her for her steadfastness, for her refusal to seek glory, for her commitment to the crown's duties without complaint. To act now would shatter that image. It would cast her in a new light, not as the obedient sister, but as the challenger who dared to oppose a queen consort's family. Yet, Anne knew that true loyalty was not blind devotion, but the courage to defend the crown even when it meant standing alone. William's voice trembled with reluctance. He feared the backlash, the headlines, the inevitable fracture within the family. But beneath his hesitation was a recognition he could not deny. Anne was right. For the monarchy to survive, for the line of succession to remain pure and unshaken, someone had to draw the line his father would not. And if not William, then Anne the sister, who carried Elizabeth's wish like a torch in the dark. It was in the silence of her study that Anne began to draft the decree. The ink flowed like blood, every word sealing a future from which there could be no return. Her hand did not tremble, for she knew hesitation would only breed ruin. Each line was written not with anger but with unyielding duty. It was not an act of spite, but of protection of a legacy, of a promise, of a throne that had already weathered centuries of storms. Yet, even Anne knew this decree would unleash a storm, and the first winds of it were already shaking Buckingham Palace. The moment whispers of Anne's decree leaked, the palace corridors erupted. Gasps, slammed doors, urgent calls. It was as though history itself had been torn open. And at the center stood Camilla, her face pale with rage and disbelief. What was meant to remain hidden within sealed envelopes and guarded hands now spilled through Buckingham's gilded halls like wildfire, and no one could contain it. Senior courtiers, long accustomed to maneuvering carefully through politics and tradition, were struck with shock. For decades, they had maintained the appearance of stability, no matter the storm outside. Yet this time, the tremor came from within, rattling the very foundation they had sworn to defend. The decree was not just a private rebuke, it was a weapon, signed and sealed by one of the Queen's own children, and it landed with the force of betrayal. Panic rushed through those who understood the magnitude of what Anne had done. This was not gossip, this was law. Charles, blindsided, could scarcely believe the words spoken in hurried whispers around him. A decree? From Anne? And against Camilla's family? For the king, it was unthinkable. He had trusted his sister, leaned on her loyalty, depended on her discretion. To discover that she had not only acted in silence, but had struck directly at his wife's family, left him wounded, reeling, almost paralyzed. He could not decide whether this was treachery, or whether it was the fulfillment of his mother's warnings he had so long ignored. Camilla, however, felt no paralysis, only fury. She stormed through those chambers with words that scorched the air. To her, this was nothing less than character assassination. She accused Anne of betrayal, of scheming, of daring to undermine her marriage and her children's dignity. Her voice, sharp with rage, echoed against walls that had seen centuries of conflict, but even they seemed to tremble under her fury. To Camilla, this was not a decree, it was a declaration of war. William, though younger, stepped forward with a composure that silenced the clash for a fleeting moment. He reminded them that this was not about personal battles, nor about pride. This was about the crown, about its survival, about honoring Elizabeth's vision. His voice carried the weight of both duty and inevitability, for he knew what his father did not want to admit. The monarchy could not withstand being seen as a prize for those without rightful claim. Yet his words did little to ease the anguish. It only reminded them all that the family was now divided, perhaps beyond repair. Beyond the palace walls, the whispers had already reached the press. Journalists pieced fragments together, scattering them across headlines that sent shockwaves through the nation. Words like banishment, betrayal, and crisis appeared within hours, each headline, painting the monarchy as a house tearing itself apart. What Anne had signed in silence was now being debated in every living room, dissected on every news panel, and shared across the world with breathless fascination. For the monarchy, this was one of its most dangerous internal crises in living memory. Not because of enemies from abroad or protesters at the gates, but because of a family tearing itself open from within. The world had always looked to the crown for continuity, yet now it saw fragility, division, and the possibility of collapse. But if the palace halls were in chaos, what unfolded in the private royal chambers would redefine family bonds forever. Charles and Anne had always stood together. From childhood to adulthood, their bond was unshakable. But now, a single piece of parchment signed in Anne's hand threatened to sever their relationship forever. What once united them as siblings bound by love and duty now became the very thing tearing them apart. The king and his sister, once inseparable, now stood on opposite sides of a battlefield neither had ever wanted to enter. The confrontation was inevitable. Charles demanded answers, his voice breaking under the strain of disbelief. He pleaded with Anne, asking how she could move against him, against Camilla, against the family he had fought so hard to protect. To him, this was no decree, it was betrayal, a wound delivered not by an enemy but by the sister who had always been his most loyal ally. He begged her to see Camilla's family not as opportunists but as part of his life, his love, his stability. But Anne, though pained, could not be swayed. With unflinching clarity, she reminded him of Elizabeth's words, the warnings their mother had whispered in her final days. This decree was not born of malice, but of loyalty to their mother, to the monarchy, to the people. Anne's refusal was not coldness but sacrifice, for she knew the cost it demanded of her. Every word she spoke cut deeper into her, the brother's heart, yet she could not allow sentiment to undo what she had sworn to protect. The palace, for all its grandeur, had never felt so small as it did in that moment. Two siblings, bound by history and love, now found themselves consumed by the weight of destiny. The pain was palpable, heavier than any crown. Charles, caught between his heart and the throne, struggled to reconcile the two. To defend his wife's family was to reject his mother's legacy. To embrace Anne's decree was to betray his wife's trust. No matter his choice, loss was certain. Anne, too, was not spared from anguish. Her eyes carried sorrow, though her words carried steel. She knew this rift would never truly heal. that her brother would never look at her the same again. Yet she pressed on, because to falter would mean surrendering the very essence of what the monarchy had stood for through centuries of trial. The silence between them was thick with grief, punctuated only by Charles's broken voice and Anne's unwavering resolve. Tears did fall, though not always seen. They were felt. Silent, bitter tears of a brother realizing his sister had chosen duty over him, and of a sister who had chosen the crown over her own heart. The bond that had once seemed eternal was fractured in a way that could not be repaired. No reconciliation could undo the sting of this moment, for both knew it would remain etched into the story of their family forever. But Anne's resolve was unbreakable, and the next move would not be hers, but Camilla's. If Anne thought Camilla would retreat quietly, she was mistaken. Camilla, humiliated and enraged, gathered her allies for one last stand. She would fight the decree, and she would do it with fire in her voice and fury in her eyes. What Anne had sealed in silence, Camilla sought to tear apart with defiance, determined to prove that her family would not be erased without a battle that would shake the very heart of the monarchy. The first move was to summon those closest to her, her children, her confidantes, her long-standing allies in the palace, who had always whispered in her favor. In heated conversations that stretched into the night, Camilla laid out her case. To her, the decree was not an act of duty but an attack, an insult that threatened not just her family but her dignity as queen consort. She framed it as a betrayal of loyalty, painting Anne as a rival who had waited years for an opportunity to wound her. The room swelled with agreement. For those loyal to Camilla saw Anne's actions as a direct attempt to rewrite the balance of power. Her most dangerous weapon, however, was not fury alone. It was her ability to sway Charles. She pressed him relentlessly, reminding him of the sacrifices she had made, the years she had stood by his side, the scorn she had endured to finally be accepted at the heart of the crown. With tears falling one moment and anger burning the next, she pleaded with him to undo what Anne had done, to rise as king and strike down his sister's decree. Charles, already torn between heart and duty, found himself pulled deeper into a storm that threatened to consume him entirely. Outside the private walls of their chamber, whispers spread of Camilla preparing a counter-declaration, a document that could, if signed by Charles, strip Anne's decree of its power. Whether it was truth or rumor, the effect was the same. The palace shook with uncertainty. Loyalties fractured. Staff who had once carried out orders with precision now hesitated, unsure whether to align themselves with the king's wife or his sister. Every corridor became a battlefield, not of weapons but of whispered allegiances and silent choices. Behind her fierce determination, however, Camilla's emotions erupted in private. Her tears fell freely, but they were laced with rage, not weakness. To her, this was not about protocol or legacy. It was personal. She felt mocked, cornered, and stripped of respect. The woman, who had fought for decades to be accepted, now found herself branded as an intruder once more, her family cast out as though they had never mattered. That humiliation only fueled her fire, and yet, in her relentless defiance, Camilla risked breaking tradition itself. To openly challenge a royal decree, to divide the monarchy further by threatening rebellion, was to invite disaster. The monarchy had weathered wars, betrayals, and abdications, but few dared to openly defy its written laws. Camilla's willingness to do so signaled a dangerous escalation. She was not simply resisting Anne's actions, she was shaking the pillars of the monarchy itself, daring it to collapse or bend to her will. Yet even as Camilla prepared for battle, the people outside the palace walls had already chosen their side. For centuries, the British monarchy survived because of the people's faith. Now, as the decree became public, the nation's voice was louder than ever. Cheers, tears, protests, every corner of Britain burned with opinion. And one truth rang clear. The public saw Anne not as a rebel but as the true protector of her mother's legacy. What had begun in secrecy within the palace now ignited a storm across the nation. A storm that no royal decree could silence. Shock spread like wildfire, touching every street, every cafe, every household. Some citizens wept, overwhelmed that one of the Queen's children had finally dared to act on behalf of the people's long-held unease. Others were outraged, their voices rising in defense of Camilla, condemning the fracture as cruelty toward a woman who had endured years of scorn. Yet even in this divide, one undeniable truth echoed through the country. The monarchy was no longer a distant institution. It was a battlefield of loyalty, duty, and betrayal, and the people were witnesses to every blow. The media, relentless in its hunger, poured fuel on the flames. Headlines screamed of rebellion and betrayal, painting Anne as the shadow, queen who had dared to strip Camilla's family of their influence. Nightly broadcasts replayed the words "royal decree" with a gravity that shook households across Britain. Tabloids crafted tales of conspiracy, while commentators debated whether this was an act of courage or destruction. For the monarchy, the press had always been a weapon, sometimes a shield, sometimes a dagger, and now it cut both ways. As the storm of coverage spread, support for Anne and William grew. People saw in them the echoes of Elizabeth's discipline and Diana's devotion, a combination that inspired loyalty across generations. Crowds outside royal palaces chanted Anne's name, while younger Britons rallied behind Catherine, seeing her not just as a future queen, but as a symbol of honesty and resilience. The generational tide was shifting, and it was clear that Anne's act had opened a door that could never be shut again. Camilla, however, fared far differently in the public eye. Though she still had her defenders, many began to see her family as overreaching, stepping into spaces that were never meant for them. What Anne had revealed, or at least implied, became enough to taint public opinion. The whispers of ambition, the suspicion of entitlement, all hardened into a narrative that placed Camilla on the wrong side of history. No matter her tears or fury, the tide of opinion swelled against her. The monarchy's survival now hinged not on tradition alone, but on this act of defiance. Anne's decree, though shocking, became a lifeline for those who believed the crown had lost its way. By cutting away what the public saw as excess, she had preserved its core. Yet the cost of such preservation was steep. The monarchy was fractured, the family divided, and the battle between loyalty to blood and loyalty to the crown had reached a point of no return. And so, as the nation roared with divided voices, the future of the monarchy rested on one question: would the decree hold, or would Camilla's fury undo it all? The ink was dry. The decree was sealed, and as the royal council declared it official, Princess Anne stood silently, her eyes reflecting both sorrow and strength. The family of Camilla Parker Bowles had been banned, forever written out of royal destiny. What had begun as a secret whisper in Windsor had now hardened into unshakable law, carried not by rumor, but by the authority of the crown itself. The confirmation was delivered in measured tones, the kind of solemnity reserved for moments that define history. Yet behind the formality lay a storm of emotion. Anne, though unflinching in her stance, felt the weight of the decision press against her heart. This was not triumph without cost. Her victory, if one dared call it that, was edged with sorrow, for she had safeguarded the monarchy, but carved a wound through her own family in the process. It was the kind of act that only time or perhaps eternity could judge. Charles, seated in silence, bore the decree like a man carrying both crown and cross. His heartbreak was quiet, but undeniable. He had lost more than just a battle for his wife's family. He had lost the last thread of unity with the sister who had once been his greatest ally. Yet beneath the grief, there was a reluctant acceptance. Deep down, he knew his mother's shadow still loomed over him, her final wish echoing through Anne's actions. To resist further would be to deny not only his sister, but the very legacy of the monarch he had spent his life honoring. For William and Catherine, the moment marked a profound shift. Their position in the monarchy had been strengthened, their future path cleared of distractions and rivalries that could have jeopardized their rise. The public's growing loyalty to them now aligned with the institution's survival, and in that alignment, the crown found a renewed heartbeat. To the people, Anne had become the shield, but William and Catherine were the promise, the ones destined to carry forward what had been preserved through sacrifice. In the silence that followed, the symbolic victory of Elizabeth's wish became clear. Anne had not acted for herself, nor for glory. She had acted to fulfill the quiet command of a mother who had seen what her children could not. That wish, once buried in whispers, now lived in the open, shaping the monarchy's path for generations to come. It was not just a decree against a family. It was a reaffirmation of the crown's integrity, a declaration that duty would always rise above desire. And yet, the finality of the moment carried with it an ominous shadow. This was no neat resolution, no peaceful ending. For every door Anne had closed, another had been forced open. Resentments simmered, loyalties fractured, and the embers of conflict still glowed beneath the surface. The monarchy had survived this storm, but the horizon promised new tempests waiting to rise. And as the echoes of the decree spread across the world, one truth became undeniable. The crown would survive, but it would never be the same again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.